Hello and welcome to Wisconsin in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content of the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent, Benjamin Yount. How are you, Ben?
The beard is finally at Santa length. So this weekend is the first of my many appearances as jolly old Saint Nick. And in true Wisconsin form, I will be appearing at a bar.
Sounds like fun. Ben, now do you go all in? Do you dye your beard silver?
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
We've got this great white theater paint, essentially. It's used, in every high school production where they have to paint someone's hair because, of course, high school kids don't grow beards this magnificent. The wife will spend all night Friday night painting my beard white, and we've got the Santa suit and everything, a bag full of candy canes, though I'll have to clear out the whiskey because I did that for work last year, so I have to make sure there's none of that. Don't want to be mixing up what I'm giving the kids for their holiday treat.
Ben, dare we tell our listeners where you're going to appear? Or
If you want to go to Bobby's off of Lisbon in Brookfield, I will be there. It is a Santa breakfast for the kids as he raises money for Children's Hospital.
Well, there you go, listeners. If you want to see Ben as Santa Claus, just don't scare the kids, please.
Was that for me or was that for them?
Take it as you will, Ben. It's open to interpretation. We are recording this on Thursday, December 7th. Ben, public sector unions in Wisconsin have filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn Act 10, the historic legislation signed into law about 12 years ago by former Republican Governor Scott Walker. Act 10 limits how public employee unions can negotiate their contracts. The fight over Act 10 made national headlines when it was being crafted, and government unions unsuccessfully attempted to recall then-Governor Walker. Now that Democrats have a majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, this is yet another attempt to undo something put in place by Republican leadership. Ben, you've been covering this story for the Center Square. Tell us more.
The original incarnation of the Franklin News Foundation was born in Wisconsin during the push for Act 10. That's how far back this goes. That's how far back I go with this story. I was there at the Capitol when thousands upon thousands upon thousands of teachers and public union supporters essentially camped out at the Wisconsin State House for the better part of a month almost. John Oliver at one point rode a camel on the state Capitol grounds. It was an odd time. And you're exactly right that the fight over Act 10 does go back to 2010, 2011, and many on the left here in Wisconsin have not given it up. That's not a political statement. That is just a statement of fact that the state's largest teachers union, WEAC, as well as Governor Evers and many other top elected Democrats, have made rolling back Act 10 their number one priority. And in Wisconsin, as we've talked about a lot here on the podcast, you have a Republican-controlled legislature. It is a veto-proof majority in the state Senate and nearly a veto-proof majority in the state Assembly. We have a Democratic governor, but there's no way that Democrats would have been able to find the votes to overturn Act 10 through the regular legislative process. This is one of the reasons why Wisconsin's Supreme Court election back in the spring was the most expensive race ever, costing $50 million. The idea was to get Janet Protasewicz elected, not only to deal with legislative maps and abortion, but to deal with things like Act 10 and likely right to work coming down the pike. This has been the dream of Democratic leaders here in Wisconsin for the better part of a decade. And now that they have the numbers on the court, they are going to go forward. And the lawsuit, this latest lawsuit, says that essentially Act 10 has created two different categories of public sector unions because Act 10 really only applied to teachers unions. It applied to ASME members or SEIU members, but it did not apply to cops or firefighters or prison guards. They were exempt from Act 10. And this lawsuit now from the liberal groups, the public sector unions, says that violates Wisconsin's constitutional guarantee of equal protection. Again, this is a challenge based on Wisconsin's Supreme Court. That way, the strategy is to limit any appeal to the United States Supreme Court. But this goes back to a simple question of, can they get this case to the Supreme Court, because once it gets before the Supreme Court, Lord knows what the argument is going to be, and the justices can pick it up and then try to remedy whatever they feel went wrong. It is important to note that Act 10 was taken to the conservative Supreme Court here in Wisconsin, and it was upheld time after time. The powers that hated Act 10 went on to try to recall Scott Walker. He won that election. Act 10 has saved the taxpayers of the state of Wisconsin almost $17 billion over the past decade or so. It is very popular, but it remains unpopular with the teachers' unions, with the governor, and likely with the new liberal majority Supreme Court.
Assembly Speaker Robin Vos and former Governor Walker himself have weighed in on what a repeal of Act 10 would mean, or in this case, the Supreme Court ruling that it's not constitutional. What have they said if this happens?
I think Scott Walker, the former governor, the man who signed Act 10 into law, probably had the best quote on this. And he said essentially that if you end Act 10, you're turning Wisconsin public schools over to the union bosses, the quote we used. So I want to make sure that in this school district and every other school district across the country and in every other municipality and county, that the people we elect locally are the ones in charge, that we don't go back to a system where a handful of union bosses call the shots across the state. What Act 10 did is it limited what unions could bargain for in their contracts. All of a sudden, they weren't allowed to add regular increases to their benefits. They weren't allowed to roll pensions in. It simply says you can negotiate for salaries. That's it, period, end of sentence. Act 10 also tied the rate of inflation to those teacher raises. So no longer were there 16, 20, 25% raises included in these 3-4 year teacher contracts. If inflation was 2.3%, that's what these teachers got. Now, just sort of an aside, here during President Biden's term, where inflation has spiked, teachers' unions have used that spike in inflation to get from school districts the maximum raise that they could, 17%, I think, in some cases. So while they do not like the limitations of Act 10, teachers' unions across the state have used Act 10 and its wording to get the maximum amount. But the call from Democrats, Chris Larson, the Milwaukee Democrat in particular, is this idea that somehow teachers' pay has fallen 12% since Act 10 was signed. And that's more of a, well, if you would have continued that upward trajectory, they'd be getting paid this now instead of getting paid that. And that's the split on Act 10. Governor Walker, the former governor, Assembly Speaker Robin Vos, so many others on the right at the Wisconsin Capitol take a look at that graph and say, you see, that's how much it has saved taxpayers, whereas teachers' unions and Democratic lawmakers say, see, this is how much Act 10 has cost teachers, and that's the split.
And this is a story, of course, that is not going away anytime soon. We look forward to your continued coverage of this story through the court system, but that is all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with the ongoing legal fight over Act 10 and more of Ben's coverage of Wisconsin state government at thecentersquare.com. For Ben Yount, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.